What's up, guys, and welcome to the Dice Monday podcast. We have another epic episode for you today. I spoke to the co-founder of original Small Beer Brew Co, Felix James. You've already seen the YouTube video out of the tour and the tasting, and then this is the full podcast episode. There is a bit of background noise. We were in the brewery and there were brewing beers behind us, but we had the microphones on so the audio is crystal clear. So if you like the video, click the like button, click the subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.
Roscoe, cheers.
Welcome to the Dice
Good to
Monday
have you here.
podcast.
Yeah.
Absolutely delicious. New flavor, Blanche. Check it out in stores. Okay, so let's go back a little bit for my community who wouldn't have met you and wouldn't know Small Beer. We have quite a big South African community.
Sure.
Where did you grow up, and sort of take us back a little bit?
Absolutely. Wow. Okay. All the way back.
Yeah, we want to get to know you.
Totally. So I grew up in Shropshire, which is in England, but kind of on the Welsh border. So we call it the West Midlands.
Okay.
Sort of halfway up the country. So sort of suburban, slightly rural. You know, I used to run around in fields. And actually, at the age of 4, I made my first beer.
Wow. That's young. Were your parents into it?
I didn't quite know it was beer at the time.
Okay.
I was fermenting. We had these little glass milk bottles.
Oh, wow.
I was doing an experiment and I loved running experiments, but where I fermented some sugar water in a glass bottle, and I put a balloon over the top. And as the yeast starts to convert the sugar into alcohol, it produces CO2, and it blew the balloon up. And I was just...
You were 4 years old.
Loved it. Yeah. Well, yeah, it was a great experiment. But
Yeah.
I think the experiment was all about, teaching kids that you can blow up a balloon. It was all about the balloon for everybody else. For me, I was like, there's living stuff in this water. What is going on? And that's just always fascinated me. I've always loved the microcosmos, right?
Wow.
Like this
Yeah.
kind of the detail.
The biology of it almost.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And that kind of manifested itself at school. I was always fascinated by animals and soil and all this kind of stuff. And then I got into food. Actually, when I left school, came to London for university.
Yeah.
And I was cooking and selling food. I worked at Borough Market near London Bridge. And I was very much kind of immersed in food, but also studying biology at this point.
Okay.
Just like really, really excited by the whole thing. And I realized that beer is almost like the intersection between kind of science and biology and food.
Okay.
You've got all the flavour. The flavours develop so much when you're brewing beer. When you start out and you kind of do the active part of making the unfermented beer, it tastes nothing like beer. And that's because the yeast does so much work. There's a great saying in brewing, which is that brewers don't make beer. Brewers make wort, which is the unfermented beer.
Okay.
And yeast
Does
makes
the
beer.
work. Yeah. Okay.
So it's one of these things where you give the yeast this stuff, and it can surprise you, depending on what sort of yeast you're using, what sort of conditions you're in. You end up with completely different flavors, and you can end up with fruity flavors. You can end up with all sorts of such a wide array.
The craft market of beers has gone out of control at the moment with the different flavors.
Yeah.
But before you got into beer, did you have a little stint in non-alcoholic gin? Is that where you met your partner?
Not non-alcoholic gin. Actually, that was in. So it was gin.
It was
Sipsmith.
Sipsmith. That's it.
Yeah. They do get confused. There's a non-alcoholic gin brand.
I'm pretty sure that's what I read. Oh, okay.
Yeah. A little bit confusing, but no, that was actually. So that was way into my brewing career. So I was studying biology. I was in the food industry. Then I got into beer.
Yeah.
Actually, my first job in brewing was for the biggest brewing company in the world. What is now the biggest brewing company in the world as well, but at Budweiser.
Okay.
So Anheuser-Busch,
Good beer as well.
now AB InBev. To me personally, I was such a foodie and I was kind of into the craft, and I heard about this job going, and when I first heard that it was Budweiser, I was a bit like, maybe I don't want to make, big name beer. And how wrong was I thinking that? Because actually, learning from the big guys was just fundamental to my entire, the rest of my career. I've now been brewing beer for 20 years this year.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
20 years, nice.
Cheers. And it really wouldn't have been the same had I not had that grounding and understood actually what it takes to make beer at that kind of scale and to that degree of precision. So I was just saying that, fermentations can surprise you. Well, there's no room for surprise when you're making hundreds of thousands of liters of beer, right? It's got to be right every single time. And so you need to know how to hone the craft, and you need to know how to get that yeast doing exactly what you want it to do.
We'll get into the brewing process, but how did you transition from Budweiser to sort of starting your own brand?
So coming out of Budweiser, I was actually only at Budweiser for a fairly short period of time. It was less than 2 years, and I moved to a regional brewer called Fuller's Brewery. So they're best known for making London Pride, which is one of our big regional cask beers, kind of traditional British English ales. And I worked there. I was there for 6.5 years.
Okay.
Kind of working my way up the management chain, and I always had this dream of setting up
your own brewery.
A brewery.
Yeah.
In fact, even more than that, I wanted to set up like a brewery as part of a wider food business. I had this kind of idea that we'd make like a food warehouse, and it would be making all sorts of different foods.
Combination,
predominantly using fermentation as the basis of it.
So just explain fermentation to the people that wouldn't understand it completely. Is it a long process, or is it?
So, it depends entirely what you're making. So when I first got into food, I was making bread, which you might, bread, if you're making a fresh bread, you can...
Fresh sourdough.
The fermentation might be...
Bangs.
It might be like an hour, for if you're using a cultured yeast. If you're using sourdough, it might be a day or a few days, or potentially you might have a starter running for years, right? So fermentation is about using microorganisms, feeding them with food, and allowing those microorganisms to change that food. So fermentation is responsible for foods like, bread is a classic example where you're using the fermentation predominantly in that instance to produce carbon dioxide. So you want to blow up the bubbles in the bread in order for it to be light and fluffy.
Yeah.
But you might, and in sourdough breads, you're using it for flavour as well, to give it that tangy flavour that's coming from the fermentation. But you also use fermentation in things like kimchi and sauerkraut, so to break down and preserve, in a way, your cabbage or your vegetables.
Okay.
You use it in making yogurt. So yogurt is fermented milk, and you get that all over the world in all of its various forms, right? You can use fermented horse milk, or fermented cow's milk, or fermented sheep's milk.
I mean, we hear that, from yogurt's made from that, but you never really understand it,
Yeah. Yeah, and look, they're all, it's basically using a microorganism. So you're using something you can't see with your own eyes.
Crazy.
But you can see with a microscope.
Yeah.
And it might be a yeast, it might be bacteria. So these, the yeasts that we use for brewing are cultured yeasts. They're very specific yeasts that are just single strain yeasts that are used for one very specific process. So we have 2 cultures of yeast in our brewery. Okay. One is called Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is a lager yeast.
Okay.
I'm not making it up.
No. Yeah. You said it so perfectly.
Saccharomyces pastorianus.
Right.
Then you've got a separate one called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is a completely different organism. It's a yeast again, but it produces ales.
Right.
rather than lagers.
Yeah.
So two different things.
Okay.
But those, yeasts, if you had a yeast, like a yeast cell, imagine a yeast cell like the size of the Earth.
Yeah.
Then if you had bacterial cells around that, they'd be absolutely minute. Like yeast are so different to bacteria. They're a completely different organism. So all of this, none of this we can see. So these are, we use them all for fermenting different foods. Yeah. But beer was the one that I decided
to go for.
And
rightly so.
It was exciting.
Yeah.
Produces alcohol, which we know and love. It brings us together.
So how did you get the concept of small beer?
So this was kind of further down the line. I'd already been in the brewing industry for, coming up to 10 years.
Did you come up with the name?
Well, that's a good question. Let me get to that.
Okay.
So I started working at Sipsmith Gin Distillery.
Yeah.
Which was great from a sort of personal development idea, sort of seeing this business that started out really small. I joined when there were 12 people, and over the next 3 years, the business just absolutely boomed. And we got to the point where there were 70 people 3 years on in the business. We were selling to 50 different countries. We were a global gin brand. But that is where I met my business partner, James. So I was the head of operations there. He was the head of sales. And we used to go for a beer after work. And, the last thing that you wanted at the end of the day was to drink a gin and tonic, because we'd been around gin all day. And particularly for James, because he was selling. So he was out in
he had
London,
to market, he had to drink.
Going and
gin's quite a hard, emotional drink.
It's when you've been out and you've had a few sips of gin all day with people, particularly on a hot day, I mean, it can be, it's hard work. I know it sounds like bliss, but when you're doing that day in, day out, it's a tough gig. We used to go for a beer after work, and we'd had really long days. And what we really wanted was the flavour of a beer. We also wanted that little kind of relaxant, a little bit of alcohol in the system. And yet we knew that if we drank 1 or 2 pints of 5% beer, we'd be falling asleep on the way home. And, and certainly wouldn't be getting up bright and fresh and ready to do it all again the next day. And so we were looking at we'd turn up at the pub and we'd look at the badges, the funk badges on the front of the bar. And we'd be like, okay, these are all great, but they're all in the kind of 5s. Sometimes you get a 4%, sometimes you get a traditional cask beer that might be 3 or 4%.
Yeah.
But it would be there one day, the following day they put a different beer on. It was all, it was really hard to get something that was consistent and something that wasn't going to absolutely knock us for 6 every time. So we were like, there's a major gap here. We're not being looked after we're turning up to this establishment. It's either 5% and above,
or gin,
or 0%, or gin. Yeah. So we said, hey, look, I obviously knew how to brew at that point. And I had built my home brewing setup to a point where it was kind of semi-commercial.
I can only imagine your homebrew setup. Has this become the homebrew setup
This
now?
is the homebrew setup, exactly. It's all around you. So James and I basically started making beer on the weekends, and then eventually evenings. Everything. We were just obsessed with making a beer that we could drink and would just be, around that sort of 2.5, maybe 3% mark. We ended up with 2 to 2.5, and the reason that we ended up there was a very, very key one, and this is where the name comes in, right? Because you were like, did you come up with a name?
Yeah.
So we stole the name.
Wow.
We stole the name from history. So for the vast majority of the last 1,000 years, people like you and me, but also
I read something about
school
this.
children right through to high society, everybody was drinking small beer. But this isn't the small beer that we make here. This was small beer, so this is what people used to drink instead of water. So they would drink a beer that it wasn't as strong as other beers. In fact, it was made as a byproduct of making beer. So you would you'd use your mash, so you'd combine grain and water to make a kind of a cereal juice,
Right.
for want of a better word. And then you'd then use that unfermented beer to make a strong beer, like a 5% beer,
Right.
say. And then you would add more water. It's a little bit like if you were making tea and then you used your tea leaves again for a kind of second flush.
Right.
So you'd add more water to your mash and you would use those second runnings to make a smaller beer. And that beer was, it still had flavour.
So it was small in terms of the ABV, the alcohol content. Okay.
Exactly. Now, that's not the same stuff as we make here today. If you make small beer as the second runnings, it's never going to be quite as good as the first runnings.
It's not going to have what you were talking about earlier, that true trueness.
You're not going to get the body. In fact, what you will get is a little bit more tannin from the grain, so it ends up being a little bit more bitter, a bit more astringent.
Yeah.
But that's what people were used to drinking instead of water. Now, the main reason that they were drinking it...
Instead of water?
Instead of water.
Oh, okay.
So in the daytime, so if, when you got up in the morning, you'd be drinking small beer, and then you go to work, and a lot of work, if you think back to like the 1800s, a lot of the work back then, before the Industrial Revolution, was really labor intensive.
Okay.
And so you would need to be working, you might be laying tracks for train, or you might be you might be mining.
Old labor,
These are proper jobs, and you'd need to be taking
hydrated.
on a lot. You'd be hydrating, exactly. Now, in order to hydrate, people didn't drink water, and quite often there's a bit of a misconception that people think that they didn't drink water because water was unsafe to drink. Now, in the same way that we didn't know that microbes existed, we didn't know that these pathogens existed that would make us ill. So there wasn't really a desire to stay away from drinking unsafe drinking water. The reason that people didn't drink water is because it didn't taste that good. Like today, we're obsessed with
health.
With health, and we think that drinking water should always taste great. Well, it does taste great now, but that's because we've got really good technology to strip out all the contaminants from our water and purify it. They didn't have that back then. Yeah. So unless you happen to live next to a spring or a glacier or a really nice well, you didn't have access to really good quality, clean drinking water. And so water, particularly in cities like London, tasted foul. You certainly weren't going to drink water that
still tastes like foul.
So in order to make it palatable, people would mix it with grain. And not only was it good for hydration, it was also good for nutrition. People were keen to get their calories in, because if you're doing a heavy job, you need to be feeding yourself with energy. This was like the energy drink of the day, right? So it's hydrating.
How long ago are we talking?
So this is literally going right back to the Middle Ages, and probably before, but there just aren't the records to show us that. Right up until like the early 20th century. Okay. So we're talking, there's a school around the corner from here, Dulwich College. Yeah. And they were feeding the boys small beer for breakfast until the 1950s.
Wow.
In Belgium, they were giving school children small beer until the 1970s. And there was even a program in 2003 to try and bring that back again.
And it was denied.
Well, it was one of these things where they kind of did a few trials and then it didn't really grow from there.
So no one trademarked the name back then?
They didn't trademark the name in the same way that you wouldn't trademark the name porridge or tea.
So it was like a staple
interestingly,
almost.
when we came across this, so we started brewing small beer, or brewing this beer that we didn't have a name for. And at the same time we were researching history, because we'd heard about small beer. We knew that it was a thing back then, but we didn't know exactly how strong it was. We didn't have any recipes. And then when we went to go and find out, we realized that there weren't a great number of recipes out there, because why would you have a recipe for something that you just make on a daily basis as part of your, it's very hard to find a recipe for porridge or a recipe for how to make a good cup of tea, or why would you write that down? Because everybody has their own way and everybody knows how to do it. Small beer was made in the household predominantly by women, and it was made as part of the kind of household chores. It was done as it was a staple. It was
bread, porridge, small beer.
That you had making sure that you had something to drink that was going to give you energy and was going to hydrate you throughout the working day.
Okay, so that's the name. So let's come back to the brewery.
Yeah.
Because I want to ask you, how this all works, and I did hear that you use the least amount of water in your brewery. Is that globally?
There are certainly other breweries that are pushing on this front as well. But we have done a few things that have not happened in other breweries, and we're certainly way up there with the breweries that are using the least amount.
So how does that work? So walk me through, sort of the brewing process, but then why would you use so little water?
Yeah. So the water saving is it's pretty much completely separate from the concept of making small beer.
Yeah.
The water saving is something that really we approached from
a sustainability point of view.
When we decided that we were going to start making our beer commercially, we started looking at designing. So I designed all the brewing equipment, and I designed it to do two things really well. One was to brew the very best small beer that had ever been made, and two was to save water, because brewing beer is incredibly water intensive. So when when we started the brewery, typically to make a single pint of beer, breweries were using 8 to 10 pints of water to make that pint of beer.
10 to 1.
Just in the brewery alone, right? So that's not the water that's used for watering crops. That's not the water that's used for washing the glasses at the bar, or wherever.
It's just the process.
The beer is actually being consumed. Yeah, it's just the processes in the brewery. Now that ratio has come down. So generally speaking, if you set up a new brewery today, you're looking at a ratio of about 6 to 1, so 6 pints of water to make a pint of beer. What we do here is we actually use 1.5 pints of water to make a pint of beer. And the vast majority of the water that we waste isn't really wasted at all. So that half pint, so one of the pints is basically going into making the beer. Beer is predominantly water. It's got a lot of water in it. So that other half pint that we're losing is actually ending up in the spent grain, which ends up, so after we've used the barley, after we've extracted the starches from the barley that we're going to use in our fermentation, you're left with pure protein and fiber. It's like bodybuilders' food, right? And that protein and that fiber actually goes to animal feed. So we send it out to a local farm.
Okay, nice.
And it's eaten by pigs and horses. That spent grain actually contains most of the water that we lose. But effectively all that means is the animals that are eating that spent grain ingest the water. Right. So they're getting a little bit more water from their grain, which means that they drink less water from the trough. It's as simple as that.
Is it more difficult to keep the alcohol level of these beers lower than it is to produce a 5%, say, alcohol beer while brewing? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you look at non-alcoholic beers, there are a couple of different ways of making non-alcoholic beers. It's actually a whole array of different ways, but you can break them down into two fairly straightforward methods. One is that you don't produce the alcohol in the first place.
Yeah.
So you use a slightly dodgy fermentation.
I thought I read something about Guinness 0.0, I think making it with the alcohol and then stripping it out. That's why it's more expensive.
So generally, that's the way that the bigger breweries do it. A, because it tastes better that way, and they can. B, because it doesn't disrupt their existing operation. They just want to make beer using one method. You haven't got Guinness, Guinness IPA and Guinness.
And they just have the last step where they just strip it out.
Guinness. There's just Guinness.
Because it's funny, the 6-pack or the 4-pack of Guinness 0.0 is more expensive than the 6-pack or 4-pack of Guinness.
Yeah.
Because of that extra step, basically.
Yeah. I mean, look, it makes sense.
So is that a challenge for you to?
So we don't strip anything out.
Yeah.
We brew to strength. What that means is that we use the same amount of ingredients to make our beer as you would do to make. I mean, this is our lager, right? Our lager is 2.1%. And in order to make that lager, we use the same amount of ingredients as we would do to make a 4 or 5% beer. So from a brewer's perspective, that's incredibly inefficient. So brewer's efficiency is all about taking a certain amount of grain and making as much alcohol from that grain as possible.
Right.
What we're doing is not brewer's efficiency, it's flavour efficiency. So we maximize the amount of flavour that you get from that grain while only ending up with a moderate level of alcohol, the level of alcohol that we feel is right for that beer to have.
It's right for what you were looking for. You were looking for that beer that you could drink, have a couple of drinks, but not feel hazy on the way home or in the morning.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, did you have in the back of your mind the new day and age? Because, you know, you talk about the Gen Zs and the millennials and the Gen Xs, and I actually have a table of the percentages I remember, but Gen Z obviously drinking a lot less. Millennials is quite funny. There's a stat, 68% of millennials are wanting to quit alcohol. And Gen X's, there's like hardly anything. They're like, nah, we're drinking for life. Did you have that in the back of your mind that, you know, the process, you know, alcohol is sort of being pushed out in the new age, similar to smoking? So I related to, you know, Marlboro used to sponsor Formula One. And the cars, they got pushed out, no more advertisement. Alcohol is happening the same. Heineken Zero is the only thing you see now on Formula One. They can't promote alcoholic beverages. So it's slowly getting pushed out. So in the back of your mind, was that a positive on, you know, releasing this sort of beer?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess, you know, if you look at the likes of Heineken, they're existing, you know, large companies, they need to shift what they're doing in the same way that Shell have to shift what they're doing. Yeah. Right? If you want to live in the new age, you've got to be greener. You've got to be more health conscious. You've got to, you know, reduce the impact on people's well-being, on their mental health, on their, you know.
Well, and that's what the Gen Zs focus on now.
Absolutely. If you look at the way that these, you know, these really large alcohol companies are looking at things, they all have targets to reduce the amount of alcohol in their products and reduce the impact that they have on society. Because at the end of the day, alcohol is a drug, and it does have a big societal impact. Yeah. You know, I think of the impact that alcohol has on our National Health Service, that it has on the police, that it has on our children. And if I were making stronger beer, I don't think I would sleep well at night, you know, thinking that any of our products could end up affecting people in that way. Now, I'm glad I don't have to worry about that, and I do sleep very restfully at night. So the bigger beer companies absolutely are being forced to make change, you know, to make their products less alcoholic and to try and shift to this new age. We didn't have that kind of pressure on us, right? We were setting up an entirely new brewery. So if there was pressure on the industry, we could have just said, well, we're not interested in the industry because there's clearly not a future in this industry. We're going to move out. We didn't make small beer because of industry pressures. We made small beer because it was what we wanted to drink. And I think, you know, over the years, so we've been running small beer now for 8 years, and more, you know, I'm just totally convinced that wherever there is a 5% option, you know, wherever you have the option of buying a normal beer, normal strength beer, wherever you have the option of buying a 0% beer, there should always be a mid-strength beer available. Because, you know, what we find here actually is, you might have this in South Africa as well, is that there is a tendency for people to do this thing that we now call zebra striping. Okay. Where, nice African terminology that we're using here.
I don't know it, so I'm interested.
So zebra striping is where you drink a full strength beer, and then or full strength drink, and then you follow it by a non-alcoholic drink, and then you switch back to a full strength.
I've done it.
People do it all the time. Right?
Christmas Day.
And they do it because they're trying to moderate their drinking.
100%.
They're trying to to kind of hit that nice level where you're not too drunk, you're not too sober.
Does it work if you do it that way?
It does work.
Yeah.
The only issue is that it works technically. So if we were all robots and we could feed in
It was
a pint,
straight
pint,
data,
pint,
yeah,
pint,
yeah,
and it
yeah.
was all perfect, then yes, it would work. Your system's still being a little bit more heavily impacted by a bigger hit of alcohol, but either way, it works. The only issue is that we're not robots, we're human. And so it doesn't work for two reasons. One is that taste-wise, once you've had a 5%er, going to a 0 always feels like you're missing something.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't...
They're also never really nice.
It works from an alcohol perspective, but that's just numbers, right? At the end of it, the point of drinking beer is to enjoy yourself and to enjoy the beer. Like, this isn't it's...
Yeah, 100%. You said something earlier that ties into that, where you don't have to think about the drinking of the beer. So that's like a huge one. When I go out, it's 80% of my mind is thinking about the beer.
You've got the numbers in the back
How
of your
much
head.
have I had?
How many beers have I had? Could I get away with another? What do I have to do tomorrow morning?
My
What time
sleep
do I have to
score's
wake
going
up?
down every second.
Yeah. Oh, I've got to wake up at this time. Well, you know, if I've got to wake up at this time, I'm going to have to get up at this time, and therefore I've got to catch the train home at that time.
Yeah.
And it's just numbers. Forget all that. You should just be in the moment. You should be enjoying yourself. So, it doesn't work from a taste perspective, having to flip back and forth between full strength and non-alcoholic. B, the more you drink, the worse you get at making these key decisions. So at the beginning of the night, you set a strategy, right? You say, my strategy is going to be that I'm going to zebra stripe 50-50 throughout the night.
Yeah. I like the terminology.
That all
zebra
works
stripe.
perfectly for your first 3 or 4 pints. Then you get to pint number 4 and you go,
Stuff it.
I'm supposed to be going back to non-alcoholic now, but you know, I've only got 1 more pint in me. I'm just going to go full strength, or whatever it is. And there's always a caveat.
Absolutely.
And actually, that's when you then do have your next pint, and then you go, it's a round of shots, or whatever, you know.
Then you're
and
done.
then it's the end of the night.
Yeah,
and it's KO, you know. And instead, if you were just spending all of that processing power,
Just having
all of your time,
a good time.
just having a great time with your friends, and you could have a drink in your hand, and you weren't really having to worry about it, then wouldn't that be better?
Absolutely. Like, I am 100% in. But tell me, so what's the plan to get it out there? What's the plan? How are you going to take over? How are we going to get all the bars to have this mid-level?
100%. So mid-strength is one of those things that actually as a concept, we didn't even have the term mid-strength.
How many sorry to interrupt you. How many mid-strength beers are out there in London?
Good question. So there are certainly other mid-strength beers around, not just in London, you know, globally.
Yeah.
The vast majority of them are beers that are brewed by breweries that make standard strength beers, 4, 5, 6%, and then they add like a mid-strength beer to their range because they want to diversify, because they want to create something that's different. A lot of craft breweries at the moment are putting out, you know, a non-alcoholic version of their beer or a non-alcoholic.
That's the most common you see from the big brands.
Totally. There are certainly a few dotted around that are making mid-strength beer.
But there's no real big firm that's got it up.
No, well look, there isn't a single other brewery in the world that is specialising entirely on mid-strength beer. We're still 8 years on and we're still the only ones.
That's crazy.
And that is...
an opportunity.
It's great, right? We've got that kind of first mover advantage. On the other hand, in a way it doesn't really help not to have competitors, because then there isn't a level playing field market where we can be better than our competitors and our competitors are still doing the marketing for us. Effectively, all of the marketing effort has to come from us.
Yeah.
So we've got to tell the world about this amazing, exciting thing. And hey, we can't just say it in a few words. Sometimes it needs a little bit longer for that reasoning to click.
That coin to drop, yeah.
So...
yeah, because I can imagine competitors in their different regions spread the message.
Yeah.
And then, you know, it's all about mid-level, not necessarily the brands.
Totally. So we are, you know, when people start putting out a 2% version of their beers. For us, that's a massive plus. Like, the more mid-strength beers we see out in the marketplace, I'm happy. Because then as long as we can make a better one than they are making, that's great.
Yeah.
On the other side, what I don't want to see is a market flooded with poor quality mid-strength beers. Because in the same way as the non-alcoholic market was, people then just see non-alcoholic beer as crap that they don't want to drink. Whereas recently, people have actually seen that some of the non-alcoholic beers are okay, right? They want to drink it. And therefore, that's actually got people a little bit more interested in what we do.
Right.
So what we can't have is people, drinking mid-strength beers and kind of going, that wasn't as good as a 5%er.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try it again. We want the mid-strength movement to spread, and we'll continue to ride the wave.
Nice. I don't want to keep you too long, but I do have another couple of questions. The recipe. So how do you kind of come across your recipes or flavors? Like, what's that process?
Absolutely. So when we first set up the brewery, I mentioned that I designed the brewing kit.
Yeah.
That was after a couple of years of developing this, right? So from that moment where James and I were in the pub and we were thinking, hey, why don't we have a 2% beer? We were brewing evenings, weekends, as much time as we could possibly get for about a year and a half before we started building the brewery and building the business. And during that time, I designed the brewing kit specifically to make this beer. Now, I took that design to the manufacturer, to the brewing equipment manufacturer, and said, hey, I want you to make this kit. And they came back and they said, look, we can specify the equipment for you. It's, thanks for coming to us with a full specification, but your kit is not going to make beer. And I went back to them and I said, look, it might not make beer, like any old beer, but it's going to make the very best small beer the world has ever tasted.
Nice.
Built the kit, thankfully, because it was tough. They made me sign a waiver.
Oh, wow.
To say that if anything went wrong with it, because it wasn't their design, they weren't taking any liability for it.
Yeah.
Right? So we built the kit in late 2017, so just before Christmas 2017. And the recipe really, so the first recipe that we went with was a lager.
Yeah.
And that is this year.
Is the lager the most sold?
It's now neck and neck with our hazy.
So
the lager
that's
and the hazy, but yeah.
But is the lager the most sold globally in terms of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, in terms of beer styles.
Beers, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Lager makes up like over 90% of all beer sold globally.
90%.
Yep.
Oh wow, that's wild.
Yeah. So there are vast swathes of our planet where you won't be able to get any other beer than lager.
Okay, right? Yeah. Like my house.
Like not anymore. So lager is technically one of the hardest beers to brew.
Right.
And this is because in a lager, it's really pared back. It's like making a perfect salad, right? Using just like 3 or 4 key ingredients. If you mess up, say your tomatoes just aren't that fresh and they're a bit watery and a bit crap, it's just going to completely set the entire dish off. No one's going to enjoy that.
Yeah.
Every ingredient has to be perfect. If you're making like a big full-on IPA that's really in your face, has loads and loads of flavour, it's technically much easier to create that beer because you can hide behind all this flavour. It's more like producing like a big curry or something with big bold flavours in it. So we started out with the lager because I knew that technically that was going to be the one that we had to beat. And also because if we had a lager, that is what predominantly, it's what most people are used to drinking.
It's the easiest one to start selling. From getting a consumer behind you.
It's the hardest one to make and the easiest one to sell. Absolutely right. Yeah. So we started making the lager, and then from then on, basically, once we'd nailed that recipe, virtually every other beer that just follows.
Okay.
Right? So much easier to then
Interesting.
just branch out and make. And we have, we've made a good, over the last 8 years, we've made about 10 different beer styles. We now have a core range of 4 beers. So we've got a lager, an IPA, a pale, and a hazy.
Yep.
And then
which we tasted, all
we
delicious.
add on, and then we add on some key beers. So we now have a stout that we're selling through Waitrose. We have the Blanche that we've just launched, which we're selling on our website.
Yeah.
So there are kind of individual beers. We'll create them for kind of special moments.
So these Blanches are not going to a big store?
No, this is all. So yeah,
I was going to
you're
say.
standing here looking at like pallets and pallets.
Yeah,
of beer.
yeah.
All of this Blanche is flying.
Privately bought online?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we have.
So how much does a case go for? Yeah.
So one case of 24 cans sells for just over £50.
Okay. I'm not going to do the math.
About £2 a can.
Okay. Final 2 questions. What's your plan for this year? I know that you've got something brewing. See what I did there?
Very good.
What
Very
in
good.
terms of getting the product out there or getting
Absolutely.
small beer out there?
Yeah. So we have we've got a really great base of pubs selling our beer in London, but really that's that has to be quite specific to London. It's quite hard to ship kegs and casks of beer beyond our home territory. But then we also and we're growing that continually, right? We've got about 300 pubs in London all serving our beer now, so we're really
That's cool.
really pushing that hard. But then beyond our home ground, we sell beer in cans and in bottles. They're available through Waitrose, Ocado, Majestic Wines, in lots of little bottle shops, bars, restaurants. And then we're branching out to the States. So we've just landed our first shipping container
Amazing.
on the East Coast. And that's now selling in New York, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New Hampshire.
Okay.
So kind of, we're just
Nice.
starting
Yeah.
to invade
The takeover.
from the East Coast.
What's the mid-level beer like? Is it quite popular in America, or is it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is
What's
it?
really interesting is in America, like 5% is considered like entry-level beer.
Right.
All the beers are super, super strong, but they've also got a taste now for non-alcoholic beer. And I think there's
It's that age
the
thing.
market is so ready. People really, really want this to exist, but just don't know it yet. And so the people that find it, like we're now available in Whole Foods.
They
and
get all
Total
excited.
Wines.
Yeah.
People go in there and they've got it stacked high, right? Like if you get the beer on a shelf here
Yeah.
and you get 4 facings, which means like 4 cans facing you on the shelf, you're like, yeah, I've got 4 facings. That's awesome.
Yeah.
In America, it's like,
It's different
okay,
level.
we're going to give you, half an aisle for your beer. You're like, this is insane. I've never seen so much beer in my entire life. So no, it's going well there.
Okay.
But hey, they say it's hard to break America, right?
Yeah. Watch out for the tariffs and the shutdowns.
Tell me about it. So that's
Is it?
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Still need to read all the detail on that one.
Nice.
And then, but the really big news for us is that we're about to launch in Marks and Spencer's, which
Nice.
is M&S is like,
Congratulations.
we've been working on that for the last 5 years.
Well, your product works with M&S because it's that clean cut label. Like it just looks like a product that should be in M&S.
Absolutely.
100%.
And it's, a lot of people are going into M&S with a bit of a convenience mentality, right? It's like, I'm going to grab dinner or I'm going to jump on a train and I just want to grab and go.
Yeah.
And now you can get our beautiful 4-packs of the lager and the hazy in M&S. I say now, it's from the 18th of June.
Okay.
It
Perfect
will
for
be
summer. Yeah.
live across the country, 450
Wow!
stores.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
So you'll be able to grab one of those. And
That must have been a
get
big
to
moment for you guys to get that.
Wow. I mean, massive. Yeah,
Okay.
really, really big.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, look, every time the business grows a little, we get
Amazing.
very, very excited because at the end of the day, it's about getting more small beer into more people's hands.
100%.
And really growing this movement, right? Growing the.
I still think you should tap into the athlete market, but We'll take
Absolutely.
that. We'll take that off air.
Hey, look, you're the athlete. You're going to help us.
We're going to have it in my cycling bib. That's what I'm talking about.
There you go.
Final question. Because of Dice House Monday, we're a bit of a motivational podcast. We always ask the guest at the end for something to share with the listener, something motivational. But I think in your case, what would your advice be to an aspiring brewer, coming into the beer market?
Hey, I mean, try it all. I'd say personally, what worked for me, as I said earlier, is to start an established beer brand and and then get some experience working at a smaller scale. And that goes wherever you want to. If you think that you just want to work in the craft beer industry at a low level, that's great. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but I really, really would urge you to go and see how some of the bigger guys do it. But honestly, I mean, come and speak to us.
They'll take you in.
Come to the brewery.
Yeah.
We'll show you around.
Yeah.
We can't necessarily offer everybody a job.
No.
But we can certainly show you a good time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thanks for coming down.
That was cool. Thanks, Felix.
No.
Appreciate it.